Welcome to Escapists Anonymous, the fantasy fiction book club. I'm Dan.
And I'm Sam. This is a podcast for people who love to read and who read to escape into worlds of magic and adventure. But don't let that adventure end when you finish your book.
Join us on Escapists Anonymous to carry on the conversation. Okay, so a new episode, and we are doing something a little bit different to usual. We're going to cover a whole book review in one episode. Basically, I read this book a little while ago just for fun, not necessarily for podcast purposes, but I thought it would be so much up Sam's street in terms of what I think his preferences are.
Up my cobbled London street.
Up his cobbled London street. That sounds like a strange, dirty analogy. But
I thought I'd throw it in there.
Yeah. So I suggested to Sam that he read it and that we could potentially have a chat about it on the podcast. So
yeah.
We have just read The Great When by Alan Moore. And yeah, very nice artwork, I have to say, on the cover.
Yeah, it's a nice cover. It's a nice cover. And, you know, mild spoilers for the episode in general. It is nice to finally read a book where I went from beginning to end and enjoyed it the whole way. I feel like it's been a while.
Indeed, yeah. I think, you know, we do a lot of potentially looking around at what's popular on the podcast and then saying, oh, let's have a read of that. And it's not necessarily kind of following our hearts as far as reading is concerned.
It's not the stuff we gravitate towards naturally, but I think that's always been really nice about this, is that we're really pushing ourselves and trying a whole bunch of stuff. That's why we read so much romantasy.
Indeed.
You know, and ones that, you know, aren't necessarily like hard, dark, medieval fantasy all the way, you know, like, and I think it's been for the benefit, even though I've sometimes been a bit grumpy about the books.
A little bit grumpy.
Grumpy.
But shall we start with a new book, new blurb, just to give a bit of an overview, and then we will jump into our general thoughts.
Yes, I've got the book here ready. Okay, so the blurb. A propulsive tour through a fantastical London, where history and myth collide, murder stalks the streets, and the mundane becomes very magical indeed. The year is 1949, the city, London. Amidst the smog of the capital is Dennis Knuckleyard, a hapless 18-year-old employed by a second-hand bookshop. One day, on an errand to acquire books for sale, Dennis discovers a novel that simply does not exist. It is a fictitious book, a figment from another novel, yet it is physically there in his hands. How? Dennis has stumbled on a book from The Great When, a magical version of London beyond time and space, where reality blurs with fiction and concepts such as crime and poetry are incarnated as wondrous, terrible beings. But this other magical London must remain a secret. If Dennis cannot find a way to return this book to where it belongs, he risks bizarre and disastrous repercussions, such as his body being turned inside out, or worse. So begins a journey delving deep into the city's occult underbelly and tarrying with an eccentric cast of sorcerers, gangsters, and murderers, some from legend, some all too real, and all with plans of their own. Soon, Dennis finds himself at the centre of an explosive series of events that may alter and endanger both Londons forever. Pretty on point as a blurb.
Yeah, it doesn't give like huge amounts away, but it also doesn't mislead in the way that we potentially have been misled in other books.
Yeah, I mean, looking back at that now, like, yeah, we learn about the other London. There is definitely some murderers. I think early on in the book, you kind of think, if you were to read back, you're like, where's the murderers? Yeah, there's talk of like murderers happening, but none of them are actually murderers as characters. And by the end, you're like, oh, it's there.
yeah. That's a good point, actually. I think you could easily conflate the gangster plot with the murderer plot, and actually there are sort of multiple plot lines running through this book that give us lots of different angles and different experiences.
And I think, you know, in our chat before we started recording, you kind of mentioned there are 3 plots, and it's almost like they all start going at the same time, but they all finish at different points in the book. It's not that they all collide at the end. It's each one comes to its own conclusion, but Dennis is just at the center of all 3.
Yeah. So we've got a plot is as the blurb kind of very much foregrounds this book that doesn't exist coming into Dennis's possession, and him needing to return that to the Great Wen in order to avoid the various types of catastrophe, but also this gang of gangsters led by Jack Spot being after this book as a way into the Great Wen, and Dennis having to escape their clutches on multiple occasions. Yeah, we have his infatuation and relationship with the young prostitute Grace. Yeah, and then we have the unpicking of the mystery of this serial killer
that's been sort of mentioned, or there's an undertone of serial killer throughout the book, which then takes form in the character of Clive Amory.
Indeed.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I think that's the most interesting one, but I think we can come to that a bit later.
Yeah.
We should probably deal with the other, you know, the forefront one, which is the book, which is our way into, you know, the other London, the Great Wen.
Indeed.
Which, I mean, well, actually, you know, our first introduction to it is those series of little prologue snippets that happen at the start. And I really felt that, I mean, there's quite a few Terry Pratchett books that do little things like that, where you're kind of thrown into a scene. You're not told really who anyone is, and you kind of only on reflection kind of piece together who they are, whether they're entirely relevant, whether they're scene setters. Like I remember quite a few of the City Watch books began like that. I think Small Gods had little glimpses of things like that too, you know, just little ideas of where these characters are. And for ages, it wasn't actually until I was assembling my notes that I figured out who the 2 magicians were in the first one.
Okay. I mean, you're going to have to tell me them, because this is this is one of my only criticisms of this book, is that I feel like that prologue set almost like a barrier to entry to the book that might make it difficult for some people to get through, to get to what I think is an absolutely fantastic story.
Well, I mean, because Alan Moore, the way he's approached this is like, he doesn't care whether it's an accessible read.
No,
I mean, you look at the way that the moments that, you know, the scenes set in the Great Wen, the other London, occur. They're clearly supposed to be exhausting. There's no real use of full stops. Everything flows into one another. It's all really disorientating, and they go on for a really long time. And they're supposed to feel like when you see the italics coming up on a page. When I was reading and I was seeing it on the other page, I was like, oh no, I'm off to the other London. Okay, well, I can't stop reading until I've got to the end of that bit, because I just need to get through that and have that experience. And I thought that was really effective. But yeah, these prologues are also really kind of like disorientating, because you get little snatches, because you've got the other ones which kind of actually relate to other characters, like the Battle of Cable Street, quite a famous event. That's got Jack Spot in it when he was still like Chroma, whatever his original name was, and he sees the beauty of riots. Mm-hmm. The introduction of Prince Monolulu, another real person from history I was reading about. Yeah. And then you've got Dennis seeing Cripplegate being blown up, and I think seeing Shakespeare. And then you've got the other one, which I think is the event that Gog Blinko talks about, which is the Pope of Blades escaping and becoming Jack the Ripper.
Right, yeah.
But the 2 magicians at the start, the ones who were discussing the end of World War II, the end of that era, that's Aleister Crowley, I'm pretty sure, because he died in 1947, and that scene is from 1945. And then Dion Fortune, who is another, she died in 1946. Okay. But I had to look. It required research. It required me looking up different prominent members of Western esotericism who died in the mid 1940s. Like, this is a book that requires research if you want to get the most out of it.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And I get the feeling it's because Alan Moore has done a lot of research and he really wants you to know about it.
Yeah.
You know, like, I'll talk about more of them as we go through the plot and the bits that happen. But there was another point where I was like, all right, yeah, okay, I get it. You read a bit and you thought this was really interesting, so you wanted to put it in the book.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're really effective, those moments as well, as much as I'm kind of like, I felt the author in those moments.
I mean, I don't know whether it's in the book itself, but on the audio book, there's like a chapter or like a bit at the end, like where it is Alan Moore actually speaking, and he basically just says this, like, it's basically like a load of research that he's done that he wanted to include. So, but it is interesting that you didn't read that, and that yet you've mentioned all of this stuff.
Yeah,
which is basically what he's saying in there.
It really comes across. But I mean, so this initial story, after those prologues, and you kind of, actually, we should backtrack for a second. So with those prologues, you felt that they were a bit of a barrier, but did you enjoy them? And like, when you reflect back on what kind of, they showed how the Great One was always there in these characters' lives. These people are kind of like inclined towards seeing these things.
So I think that the main thing that that made them challenging was how there was lots of them. And they all jumped about all over the place to the point where it became quite confusing from an audiobook perspective. Obviously, I still didn't get who the two wizards and magicians were by the end of reading it. The rest of it, the Battle of Cable Street and Jack Spot, obviously he came up sort of later in the story, and he referenced having seen the Beauty of Riots.
Beauty of Riots, yeah.
He referenced that, and so you get the payoff later on. And like the same for the Dennis seeing a little bit of a gateway into the Great Wen, and then that almost kind of tying in why he's able to then access it, later on in his life and stuff like that. So I didn't think it was like bad in terms of setting things up. However, do I think you could have just jumped straight into the story without having read the prologue and had a perfectly good time? Yes.
Yeah. But it's that intentionality. Like Moore has put those in because he wants for you to get a little glimpse of how disorientating you're going to find reading this book at sometimes. Like, there's an artistic intention behind all of it. It's not just, I wasn't quite sure what I was doing.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that, we know Alan Moore from, anyone that kind of knows Alan Moore knows that he does not give a shit about whether it's accessible to people. Like, he's writing the book that he wants to write. And returning to these plots, the construction of creating a book that shouldn't exist in the real world because it's just a book that's referenced in another book. There's a kind of classically like Alan Moore-y like bizarreness that initially, you're just like, yeah, okay, this is what I'm expecting from this.
Yeah, but I mean, like, also, it's a common theme that we found with some fantasy. Like, several of the books we've read in this podcast over the last year have been books about books. Yeah. So there's that. It's almost like when you watch a film about the history of cinema. It's one of those. But also, like, Alan Moore acknowledges it because there's a point where Dennis is off for the drink with Austin Spare, and he's sat down with Gorsworth, who's the editor of Arthur Macon's later works, I think, or like oversees the works, and he's waxing lyrical about how amazing N is as a short story, and he goes, using a book as a literary device, devilishly clever, wouldn't you say? And it's like
fourth wall, just stroking it.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I love that. And the relationship with Grace plot, I just found so like heartbreaking like it was just one of these, like, I don't know, I think you can sort of sense the direction that it's going, that it's never quite going to be this kind of requited thing. But
I was really glad about that.
But you're still hopeful all the way through.
Well, yeah, you experience Dennis's hope.
Yeah.
You know, like every now and again, he's like, oh, and maybe she'll run away with me. And she's like, Dennis, I don't want to be saved. And he was like, oh. Dennis felt crushed because that was the next stage in his plan.
Yeah. He was like, and he would have tried to save her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, like, I also feel like Grace Schilling as a character, and this is interesting, I didn't make many notes on her because I felt like you say, like I kind of understood her as a character from very early on, and there wasn't much unpicking. She was a very upfront character. You find when she takes Dennis back to her flat, and she kind of explains, my mum and dad died in the Blitz. I was an evacuee. I came back and I had to just make ends meet. And you're just like, okay, yeah, I get that. Yeah,
well, there's a thing there that I think it's not just her, it's like Jack Spot as well. And I think they portray this like post-war.
So much of it, yeah.
Like everything just needed to be functional. Everything is a means to an end. Like we've been through this traumatic World War II Blitz, you know, lost family members, and the way Grace goes about earning her living, and the way she kind of views that, and the way that Jack Spot goes about earning his living, and the way he views that. It's just all of it is just. This is what you have to do, and it's so like British, stiff upper lip, like just get on with it. And that, I love the way it captured that. And Dennis Knuckleyard's a very different thing because we get his inner thoughts a lot more, and his kind of hopes and dreams and desires and stuff. But even those are very much influenced by the war and what's possible, and you know he wants to be a secret agent, but also he's, you know, he knows.
But then he wants to be a journalist or a writer.
But he's also like a young lad who's just quite easily influenced by like you know, he's got this friend who's a journalist, so he's like, you know, and he works in a bookshop.
But he's got this naivety to him, you know, like he builds himself up, he knocks himself down. I can never be a writer, I'll never be good enough. But I mean, Grace also wants to be a dancer. You know, like it's almost like like when you said means to an end, I think that was quite apt because that's what Grace is doing. She's like, yeah, I'm doing this because I need to get my life together just a little bit more. Just earn a little bit more, become a dancer, and then, you know, I can be off and maybe even be an actress someday or something like that. You know, like that's my general plan. But yeah, I mean, this whole idea of this severing of a certain London into the modern day because of the World War, like the Blitz destroying so much of London, and the Great Wen serves as this reminder that London's been burned down, ravaged by plague, destroyed in war, besieged, bombed to hell. But each time it kind of like it reforms itself. It's this ever-changing, fluctuating like city that exists beyond time. And as much as we feel like there's a severance, you know, like Grace changes her surname. Jack Spot, he's you know, got a more modern identity. And there are these interchange people, like they've been severed from their past, loss of parents, all this kind of stuff. And they're all adapting to this post-war world. But there's the reminder that the Great Wen, that London will persist. Yeah. As much as it feels like there's a new London coming, things are being lost, there will always be the Great Wen.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, you know, consistent. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, yeah, her as a character was very interesting, like very self-assured. She's already been on so much of her journey, whereas Dennis feels like he's just starting on his. And of course, when you get the revelation at the end that she's actually just 15, you're like...
It's like a hammer blow. It's like a hammer blow when it hits you, because it's not just on the level that Dennis realizes that, oh, shit, like this isn't going to happen and I can't ever see her again. It's like, oh my God, like she's been through all that and she's doing the work that she's doing, and she's a child, and all of that. It's like heartbreaking for Dennis. It's kind of heartbreaking for her, even though she doesn't ask for any sympathy from anybody whatsoever.
No, but then like it's that kind of that that mirroring, the juxtaposition of Grace Schilling and Ada Coffin, because of course their ages are mirrors. You know, she's like, Dennis, I'm 15. And then Ada says, Dennis, I'm 51. You know, like they're exact mirrors. And it's just like, okay, London is aging people faster. Like she looks like an adult and Ada looks like a pensioner. You know, it's rough, this area of London.
It's tough paper rounds at this time, post-war.
Yeah. So, you know, I thought that was kind of interesting of like, you're having this, you know, and that's also at the end of the book when Dennis finds out, it's that's almost like one of the final stripping away of his childish naivety. Like I really felt like Dennis went on such a journey in terms of his maturity and development. And like I say, I think that's why I didn't make too many notes on Grace, because I felt like she was already there and her character was there to facilitate certain elements of Dennis's. Yeah. Like she was a function within the book, an enjoyable function and one that I thought was a nice character, but like she was there to facilitate part of Dennis's journey in the same way that Coffin Ada is also a similar thing, like, but much more comic relief.
But also she has this kind of softness at the end that kind of, she acknowledges that he's just been a naive kid and now he's responsible for somebody's death and like she sees that in him and kind of, you know, sits him down with a cup of tea and just, you know, sort of understands in again this like incredibly British way of like, we're not going to talk about it, but we're going to kind of talk about it.
Yeah, we're going to talk around it. The fact that we're both murderers now.
Yeah.
But also, like, you know, she kind of like, there's a codependency at the start of the book because otherwise Ada wouldn't have taken him in. She needed someone in order to kind of crush them under heel because she reacts against things. She exists in opposition. But it's like almost like Dennis can no longer be that for her so much by the end of the book because she's developed a begrudging respect for him, for like, you know, like she knows he's been through a hell of an ordeal that most people wouldn't survive. Yeah. And so I think, I can't quite remember, but I think at the start of the book there's more cups of tea. Towards the end of the book I think there's some alcohol involved, like she gets out a really fancy bottle of whiskey or something like that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
And the transition is that pack of biscuits when they sit and work their way through half a pack of biscuits together. Yeah. And you're just like, yeah, you've earned a biscuit.
Yeah, but I think she's also kind of, there's a point where I don't know what you made of this. Like, is she, I know she's surprised when he comes back to the shop because she assumes that he's dead. Is she impressed that he survived? Or is she just feeling guilty that she gave up his bedroom like one day after he left?
A little bit. But then that's also like we're talking about with like Grace and Jack Spot as well, is like there's a practicality there. Like you can't, like there's a lot of feeling because of how hard times are that you can't really just be like, well, he's probably dead, most likely dead, and I could probably do with a few bob by selling that bed. Yeah. Yeah. You know, and it just, adds to the tragedy in the moment of Dennis's situation where he's just like, oh.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh. But it also shows that he can't stay at Ada's much longer. Yeah. Like that's, you know, it's her saying there's not much space for you here anymore.
Yeah. And it goes back to what you said. It's like his sort of coming of age, you know, his story arc in terms of growing out of some of that naivety is also growing out of, you know, being the boy that runs around after Coffin Ada and gets shouted at, albeit he's still very awkward and, you know.
Oh yeah. I mean, like I was really intrigued by Dennis as a character, and I think, you know, because we're gonna talk about the stories he goes through. I just want to address him a bit more as well. Like I found it really hard to get a hold of him, I think, early on, because you know, he is this hapless, bumbling thing. And I instantly put him in mind of, you know, have you ever read Robert Rankin's Brentford trilogy?
Nope.
So it's like the Anti-Pope, East of Ealing, the Brentford Chain Store Massacre. They're really good. They're set in West London, and it's about these two hapless drunks who hang out at a pub called I think their name is Paulie and O'Malley, and they're those kind of characters. They stumble through grand adventures, barely getting by. And in my mind, I was like, oh, he's one of those kind of characters. But then you see glimpses that like when he talks to Clive Amory and suddenly becomes this kind of like fairly like astute wit. You know, he's like making jokes, having this back and forth banter. I was like, oh, this isn't the Dennis that I saw stumbling about, unable to get his words out just one scene earlier.
I think that's where and obviously, you know, Alan Moore is not an 18-year-old lad writing an 18-year-old lad, but I think in my head, it went back to when you're 18, you're kind of faking it a lot until you make it. And
okay.
He has this kind of hero worship thing going on with Clive Amory, where he wants Clive's respect. He changes the way that he acts around Clive, and he changes the way that he acts around Grace a little bit, albeit he gets way more awkward. And he's different again around Coffin Ada. And I think it's that, like, he doesn't know who he is, but he knows who he thinks, or he has an idea of who he thinks Clive wants to be friends with, because Clive's this like successful lawyer who I mean, Dennis doesn't have a clue why Clive likes to hang around with him.
And I think this is it, is like those scenes. And so, I mean, we could talk about it now because we kind of stumbled across it, but like, those scenes really sat at odds with me, and it's partly because of that, but also on reflection, the reason why I didn't enjoy those scenes and I felt like it wasn't in keeping with it is because Clive is keeping this part of Dennis separate from the rest of his life intentionally, because he wants to kill him. And so when I was in those scenes, I was just like, what is this? And I felt like Clive was always really patronizing. And I was like, maybe it was just some element of me was just distrusting of this aristocratic posh bloke who's just like, look at me with my working class friend. And then it kind of like my that my kind of like suspicion of that almost felt like it got proven, because I was like, oh yeah, like he didn't want to be friends with him. He just wanted to kill him. And it was all just condescending banter to entertain himself rather than actually befriend Dennis, you know, for genuine friendship.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that was my thing that was my assumption, was that he was just this kind of successful middle class guy who liked to kind of make fun of Dennis, and Dennis was kind of a little bit oblivious to it, and kind of thought, oh, he likes me and he wants to be my friend and he's successful. But yeah, I mean, and now that we've touched on that, and I'd love to get your view on that mystery of Clive the murderer, because obviously, like you say, kind of on reflection, it fits in, but it totally took me by surprise as a plot. That like I wasn't thinking that there was a serial killer plot, mystery thriller to uncover in this story, and then all of a sudden, kind of the back end of this book became about that.
Well, I thought it kind of slots into place. There's so many conversations with not just Clive, but, you know, I think Grace and Dennis talk about it as well. And John McAllister, the journalist, they all talk about how the war broke England, London, and how there were so many killers. And they talk about Haig, you know, the acid bath murderer. And they say like all these different people, they're all just... you know, everyone's broken. And Clive's approach to it, again, which kind of unsettled me, was he was like, they're all doing it wrong. They've all got their MOs. They're all just doing the same thing over and over again. What you want to do is you want to kill someone differently every single time. And, you know, it's kind of like, you know, that falls into place. I thought it was a bit weird that Clive would be making a note in his notebook, which is his 4 previous victims, on alongside his general schedule for drinks with friends on Friday. Like, in a way, it's because he's kind of flaunting it and having it there. But also, what is the purpose of him writing it in that book?
I guess my question is, did the entire plot thing at the time, not like on reflection, but like at the time, did it take you by surprise that became a plot within the book? Yes.
Because after you've had the books returned to the heads of London, the city heads, and then you've got Harry Ludd coming and talking to Jack Spot, and we had another 100 pages left.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, okay, well, yeah, we need to do something. Where is this book going? And I know that at the opening of the book, he mentions Michael Moorcock. I think it's dedicated to him. And because this book had really been putting me in mind of Breakfast in the Ruins, which is, again, it kind of ambles through different stories. And it then struck me that, oh, I don't know if Alan Moore was intending this, but he structured this like 3 issues of a graphic novel. Like in the first one, you're introducing the world and there's a story, and then the book gets returned. And then the characters you've established there get picked up into the second story, which is Jack Spot wants to meet Harry Ludd. And then you have the tying off of a bit more of it, which is the Clive you've been seeing all along. So like it's almost like there's the 3. When you said there's the A, B, and C plots, it's because they're the ones that are the focus of each of those different issues. That's how I kind of see it. I have no idea if Alan Moore had that as an intentional thing or whether he would even reject that as an idea.
But if you think about what Alan Moore is really famous for, it's writing comics and I guess graphic novel-y type of literature. So yeah, I think that's potentially a really good analysis. And yeah, Alan Moore might have his own views on that, but
yeah, but it just you create loads of plot threads in the first ones where you establish the world, and you just lead them through, and different ones are picked up in the different stories. But you want to have them all there for later on, and that's why it felt like it wasn't structured like a normal story where you have the climax at the end of the book. Because even then, Clive Amory gets killed off still with like quite a few pages left to go. And then it's the kind of like the winding down of what Dennis is going to do, the realizations around Grace and the final conversations with Ada. So, it was a kind of like abnormal structure, but I think it kind of worked because it was his analysis of these different elements of post-war London and what's going on. The organized crime, the hidden history, the rise of serial killers in the mid 20th century. I mean, we haven't even touched upon the 20th century mysticism vibe that's going on.
No, well, and maybe we can segue from there into that kind of setting and world building type of stuff, because obviously we've got sort of 2 main settings, which is like our, standard real world post-war London, and then we've got this fantastical great when other London, which I think, as we've described, it's like a sort of predominantly like historical imagining of London, but it's also got these like fictional or like mythological elements to it that just kind of I don't know, like I loved it, and you've touched on it earlier, like the way it's written, and it came across in the audiobook as well for anyone that might be interested in it. They do this thing where they introduce some kind of dreamlike background noise when he goes into the Great Wen, and it becomes this like very different feeling thing when you're listening to it, to the point where I found it quite difficult because it became incredibly relaxing, because all the descriptions are so kind of nonsensical that it sends you potentially into a little bit of a daze,
like a trance,
like a daydream trance. And so, whereas as a lot of audiobook readers, probably like me, it's like you like to listen to an audiobook whilst you're doing something else, you can't really do that here. You have to decide to focus in on the descriptions, otherwise you realize that you've had about 15 minutes of description that you've just missed.
I mean, and that's so interesting how the audiobook creates such a different experience. Like, it sounds like it's still a challenge to listen to, but for different reasons.
Yeah.
You have to focus because getting real hazy here. Whereas for me, it felt like a tense, stressful experience, like an absolute barrage of description. I mean, Alan Moore, even when they're not in the Great Wen, he really his thesaurus took a beating during writing this book. Like, the amount of times where he's like, he can't describe a character in the same way twice. Everyone has to be like, the Prince Monolulu or someone like that, they're like, oh, the African tipster, and then suddenly it's like the magician of horse racing. It's like he can never settle on a way to introduce a character and stick with it, and that is like tripled when they're in the other London.
Yeah.
Like everything's just like, and it works. It works so well because it means everything is in flux. Like it's still the same thing, but it has a different name. Its description is slightly different. And so everything's just flowing around.
Or your
really
perception of it.
Yeah, because you have to remember like, okay, he's using different words to describe the same thing. Because I'd pass over something and be like, what's that he's just described? Oh, it's the street. He's describing Fleet Street again in a different way. Okay, right, because it's changed slightly. And so it was, where some people you feel like they're doing it to show off how smart they are, it has an actual purpose in the book because it's emphasizing how there is just nothing's ever permanent but always there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's another one of those things where I think, based on the stuff I was just saying about it being a challenge to not kind of drift off into a bit of a daydream whilst reading it, or even occasionally a real dream, if you're lying down whilst listening to it. So would it matter if you didn't get every single piece of information that was being passed to you in those moments? You could probably get along as long as you tuned in for the moments where there's actual meaningful action and dialogue,
and just let the rest of it kind of wash over.
And the rest of it washes over you as a kind of, this is a trippy, bizarre place that nothing is kind of seems right.
Yeah, I think you're right. You probably could. You could absolutely approach it with that being like, I'm going to get lost in this world, as lost as Dennis is, because a lot of it does pass over his head. Because, and this comes into, my experience of this is also because I have lived in London for a long time, and quite specifically, I lived in this area of London for a long time. So he's describing things and roads that I see constantly.
Yeah.
And so there was a one point, even when it's in the Great Wen, but even when it's in the normal world, he's describing specific roads. I'm like, oh yeah, I know exactly where that is. Okay, where's he heading next? Okay, yeah, you're taking there. Oh, that's different. That's from a different. So I'll get lost, and I have to be like, oh, this is because it's the 1949. So there's stuff that's going to be different. So I was focusing on all of the description as well because I was trying to see what he was referencing in the Great Wen. There was some things that are easy to get, like when he's down around London Bridge and they've just seen the anamorphic spasm and the pit filled with the popes of blades.
Yeah.
And then a big, giant glass spire appears in the sky for a second before melting. And I was like, oh, it's the Shard.
Yeah.
It's the Shard. Oh, I got that one. But then other ones I'd be like, oh, what's he referencing there? Okay, I have to look this up. But like one of the big pivotal scenes, Arnold Circus, I used to walk through that all the time to go and get my hair cut when I was heading down to Redchurch Street.
Is that where all the roads meet? And where,
when they meet Harry Ludd.
Yeah.
And it's a really lovely little place now because it's in amongst all these kind of like old flat blocks, and it's kind of a raised park. You kind of climb some steps to go up to this little bandstand park area in the middle. It's really nice.
Well, now you know there's a door there somewhere to the Great
Wen.
Look
for it.
You just got to go look for it and grab it and pull it back.
But yeah, so I can get that, like, yeah, it's about the experience of, if you want to engage with it, you can, but it becomes hard work because he's almost trying to hide the references from you and make you really want to dig them all out. But you're right, you can let it wash over you. But I wanted to know, you haven't lived in London. So what did you think about all the constant references to London? Was this something like, that you were just letting wash over you? Or were you kind of like, okay, this is really a description for someone who's really been there?
Yeah, I think a lot of this type of fantasy, and like factor in that I'm a massive fan of Ben Aronovich's Rivers of London series, which is all, I think, very similar to this in terms of it will say like he turned left onto this street and you're like, okay, well that's great. Like I don't live in London, I don't know it. Like it could be anything. I'm fairly certain, as with Ben Aronovich, that Alan Moore is making sure that this is accurate and that if you lived there, it's like a little bit of a of a kind of treat for people that know the area well.
Yeah.
Because our other Lincoln, you live in this area of London. I live in Northampton, where Alan Moore is from. He's a few streets away from me probably right now. And he writes a lot about Northampton. He's made films about Northampton where he is literally dropping in directions from the town centre to the hospital, specifically, turn right onto this road. I'm like, yeah, that is the way to the hospital. I know that as a resident of Northampton. Anybody else who hasn't spent time in Northampton watching this will wonder why on earth that section of dialogue is being included in this. But I think it is it's a treat for the super engaged reader, and I like that. I like that he does that, and I like that Ben Aronovich does that as well. And it's like adding the detail in makes it a more believable world. I think when we're talking about fantasy, sometimes we're trying to create plausibility in fantastical worlds, and actually the specificity of it adds to it, even if you don't recognize the street names or know the directions and the landmarks, etc.
I mean, you're absolutely right, because of course this book, more than most of the books, is really about the sense of place. Yeah. So it would have been a bit of an oversight if he had have been getting some of those bits wrong, because it's about, as much as he's someone who's always lived in Northampton and never, I was surprised when I realized that he was writing a book about a city that wasn't Northampton in such detail and in such a kind of like a love letter, but also one that's so, as much as it's a crazy fantasy book, so real in its love. Like, it's taking the good with the bad, the rough with the smooth. It's the kind of things you get from someone who loves living in London, because you're like, yeah, of course, all these broken, grotty areas, I love them as much as the beautiful areas. Like, it's just how London is. It's the nature, it's the spirit of the city. And so, I think he says, like, in the little dedications, like, to Michael Moorcock, who lived there longer than I ever did, and it's like he's acknowledging that it was almost like he's come to London late in life, like he stumbled across the merits of the city, where it can so easily appear like, oh, it's just it's the capital of England and everyone from London's up themselves and don't care about the rest of the country. It just misses the merits of what makes this place so lovely.
But it's interesting that you mentioned that bit about the shard appearing in the Great Wen, because I think obviously I kind of described it as like a historical imagining, but actually it's kind of a timeless imagining, isn't it? Yeah. Like it touches on past, present, and future, and sort of just pulls it all in together. And I didn't spot the shard thing, but that kind of makes more sense than it being a historical thing.
So he's not just about nostalgia, he's about the fact that it's change, it's fluidity, it's the fact that things have to go through cycles. And so he's not someone who's like, oh, things were better back in the 50s, and he's not. He's saying it was awful, it was horrible, but it's important, and it was important as every other point in time, whether that's past or future.
Yeah definitely. I mean, my kind of final thought on setting is just, obviously we've talked a bit about kind of post-war London, but just I think this is a really good example of how like the dialogue contributes to like the world building and the setting, like, and we talked about their attitude and their sort of means to an end, and very is it like utilitarian, surviving, trying to figure things out post-war. And I thought it really captured that sense of being in, late 40s London. Not that I've ever been in late 40s London to be able to know, but I really believed that this was what that period of time would have been like from the writing. And I don't know whether you kind of felt that as well.
Yeah, I mean, he captures that sense. I mean, how old is Alan Moore? Is he born in the 50s or the 40s?
Yeah, he would have been born in, I'm guessing, like 1951, 52.
So
Same age as my dad, basically.
This was a time that was already lost to people. you know, like of his generation. Like, you know, he's growing up hearing about this previous time, I guess, you know, so he's kind of like, he's hearing it from his description of his parents. And so, you know, but he's still getting it as almost a secondhand account. You know, it's not like it's removed by decades. Like he's experiencing the fallout of this, and you know, he probably has a good sense of what it was like. I mean, rationing went on for years and years after World War II, so like he still would have been through the rebuilding of it. The one final thing I maybe really think about, actually, maybe this is a thought for the end, but I was wondering about like, does this apply to other cities as well?
Yeah.
But whether we can have that as a final question.
I think that comes to a question of like, this is supposed to be book one in a series, and I don't know where I read it, but I read that he was planning on doing 5.
Yeah, it's called something Quintet. Is it the London Quintet?
That's why I think it's 5. Yeah, the London Quintet. Yeah. So I think there's a question about kind of where they go from here, because we know. And actually, my next heading on my notes is writing, like what we thought of the writing, and as we often have on this podcast, frustrations about not finishing off stories. This definitely was a contained story within a book, meaning that there's some ambiguity around what does a quintet of novels based in the Long London World. But I can imagine various different ways that you can do it. It can be like a Discworld type of thing.
Exactly. Like this could be, you know, is Dennis's story fully done? Like we know, you know, it seems so final in its interactions with the likes of Grace and, you know, the moving away from Ada. You know, all that kind of stuff. Like these stories, some of these stories are done with. Will Dennis appear in a kind of secondary role in the next book? You know, at the very final bit of the book jumps forward, I think, to the 60s or later? No, 80s, because it talks about Thatcher.
It talks about Tony Blair.
Oh, so crap, yeah. So it's jumped forward way in advance.
2000.
Who is it at the end? Which character is that in the
I thought
it was
epilogue? Dennis.
Was it Dennis or was like... Yeah. Because, of course, Jack Spot, he dies really late. He dies in like the 90s, I think, or something like that. So it could have been him. But yeah, it was either Dennis or Jack Spot, I thought, the old man at the end. Maybe it bears...
Because whoever it is kind of terrified of the Great Wen, aren't they?
Yeah. But that's I initially thought it was Prince Monolulu, because he was terrified of that cat.
Yeah.
But then Dennis also saw the cat, and Jack Spot didn't see the cat. But anyway, it still feels like a very finalized... Like the book finishes, and I loved it. It was such a treat to have a story that ended at the end of the book. Yeah.
And an example of of good contained writing.
Yeah.
It could be a standalone novel, but you know, you create concepts and you introduce characters, and you know, there are things I could imagine if I was Alan Moore that I could pick from this book and say, let's explore this character's journey and interaction with the Great Wen.
Because it's not about, like, there's no apocalypse happening. There's no end of the world. It's happening to individuals and, like, the ramifications it could have for history, but not an ending. So, like, you could even go to an earlier point in time. You could go to the escape of the Pope of Blades in 1888. You know, you could and have Gog Blinko and his mother and their attempts to go and contain it. Because we know with League of Extraordinary Gentlemen that he has jumped around in time between the 19th century, the 60s, going back and forth. Like so he's happy to play around with time. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw one set earlier. But it could also equally be like each one's a decade of the 20th century. 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you know, jumping around by that. And, you know, Dennis just becomes an older character who appears as someone else, interacts with the Great Wen. I'd love to see it as like, you know, Dennis continues to travel to the Great Wen. He'll never not be there. But we don't have to see it all. We can see it from someone else's perspective.
I mean, I wonder, given that this book takes place very much in the context and in the shadow of the Second World War, whether you could space them out in relation to like these big events in history and have the framing of what's going on in the real world be like the real thing that allows the the setting and the world to be really brought to life for us.
Wouldn't it be really interesting to have one set during the pandemic?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, because when you have Dennis walking past an abandoned Anderson shelter, and how he pictured the huddled family within it, but it's now no longer has any use. It immediately put in my mind the when you're walking through a park or outside a shop and you see "keep 2 meters," like fading stickers on the floor, spray paint of like arrows, like it's that. And in the same way that there's been that whole reflection recently, 5 years since the pandemic, no one talks about the after 1919 Great Flu pandemic, no one talked about it. It didn't appear in any media. We're having a similar thing now, and it'd be nice for someone like Alan Moore to be like, look, London went through it. Let's have that being a big pivot point for one of these plot lines, because he seems like the kind of person who would be happy to discuss this and think, no, we should, because he doesn't want to necessarily adhere to convention. So that's what I'd like.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. I mean, Mr. Moore, if you're listening,
which obviously he is. Hi, Alan.
If you haven't got your 5 novels already planned out and plotted, then feel free to steal any of these ideas from us. So to kind of move towards a conclusion, and we're already kind of just talking about how much we really kind of enjoyed this book. I think my key things are, one, if you are an audiobook listener, like, this is great. Cobner Holbrook Smith, who also narrates the Ben Aronovich Rivers of London series, narrates this and is absolutely brilliant at character work and all of that stuff. I would highly recommend 10. He's always 10 out of 10, and it was 10 out of 10 for this, and obviously does a really good job with what we've talked about, some quite like challenging passages in The Great When.
Yeah, I can imagine he had fun with it though.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the other things I loved was the really like distinctive Britishness to this book. The way that the heartbreak lands at the end and the stiff upper lip post-war stuff, loved all of that. But the other thing is Dennis as a character, and I don't know whether this would be more difficult for a female audience, but I think every bloke can kind of identify with being an awkward 18-year-old trying desperately to impress a girl that's way out of your league that you fancy, and like just ballsing it up, saying embarrassing things, like regretting saying those embarrassing things for the next like week of your life, or 10 years or 50 years or rest of your life.
20 years later.
Indeed. So I loved all of those things. And yeah, I don't know, like, whether you've got some sort of headlines of what you really loved, or potentially critiques.
No, I mean, I think I've thrown enough critiques as well about, like, the things that I think worked, didn't work, but overall really, really enjoyed the book. Such an interesting, like, I like to be challenged when I'm read as much as I want to just have an easy read sometimes. And I think this one really rewarded it. Again, I'm interested about the idea that Alan Moore, someone who's so Northampton based, made a book about London that has London almost seemingly as the center of the universe. It kind of undermines his entire kind of like personality in some ways. And I'd be interested to know if there was like in this fiction that every city has something like this, because as two people here who don't come from London, we know that there's merits to places that aren't London. And this seems to make it seem like London is all,
Well, Alan Moore's, I think his last book that he published is called Jerusalem, and it's over 1,000 pages, and it's all about Northampton. So
well, there you go.
Maybe he got that out of his system a little bit, and and maybe he thought, let's do a bit more of a commercial one now.
But I did really, really enjoy this book. I really got on well with Alan Moore's writing style, because I think it really it was a merging of Pratchett, Moorcock and Rankin, which it's such a good combination of authors for me. They're all some of my favorites.
Okay, so I mean, you've already touched on my next question is for people listening. Read this if you know,
Oh.
and you've just kind of and so you're the Pratchett fan, and that was why I suggested this to you, because I read it and I thought, I haven't read very much Terry Pratchett, but I got this sense of this kind of wacky, bizarre world creation, and the tone of voice being a little bit similar to what I remember Terry Pratchett's worlds being like, and just like a humorous tone to most of what he was writing. Would you say that's like a fair analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. But I would also really, really encourage people to read the Brentford trilogy. It's actually more than a trilogy. I read them years ago, and I'm looking at it now. So I'd read The Anti-Pope, The Brentford Triangle, East of Ealing, Sprouts of Wrath, and The Brentford Chainsaw Massacre. But it looks like in the intervening years, since I read those in the 90s, there's been a whole bunch of other ones as well, which makes me want to go and read them.
Okay, fair enough.
So Brentford Trilogy by Robert Rankin. It's, again, set in London. There's fantasy to it. There's sci-fi. It's wild, and you're grounded the whole time through these hapless, useless drunks who just hang out at a pub. You know, it's like Shaun of the Dead in book form in some ways, but they're lovely books. So, you know, awesome. If you like this, and read those.
Yeah, and I would just add on, like, read this if you're a fan of Ben Aronovich's Rivers of London series, which I've mentioned multiple times throughout this. But again, it's a very kind of light-hearted sort of tone, whilst dealing with like a brilliant plot and great characters throughout. So I think, so I think if you enjoyed those books, then you'll like this, and vice versa. So yeah, if you've read The Great When by Alan Moore and you want to give us your views, then you can do so on YouTube in the comments below. Also, like and subscribe if you're watching on there. If you are just wanting to reach out on social media, you can do so at Escapists Anonymous Pod on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, etc. Look us up, find us, drop us a message or a comment, and we'd love to hear from you. If you're listening somewhere that allows you to do so, rate and review us. That helps us to reach more people. That'd be absolutely fantastic. And we will be back in a couple of weeks' time for our next episode, and we will look forward to having you with us then. All that's left to say is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.